November 26, 1983, Heathrow Airport, London. There's a saying in London's criminal underworld: if you were lucky enough to miss out on Brinks Mat, you were lucky enough. 6 armed men broke into a warehouse that morning, expecting £3 million in cash. What they found was 6,800 gold bars, 3 tons of pure gold, £26 million sitting in the vault. They thought they'd won the lottery. They had no idea they'd just signed their own death warrants. But this isn't just a story about a heist. It's about the gold that couldn't stay hidden, the money that couldn't stay quiet, and the trail of bodies that followed for the next 40 years. More than 20 people connected to this robbery would meet violent ends. One man was found dead in his garden. Police thought it was natural causes until the autopsy revealed 6 bullet wounds. £26 million in 1983. That's approximately £290 million today. Over $390 million, the largest peacetime robbery in world history at the time. And here's the thing, if you bought gold jewelry in Britain after 1983, there's a chance you're wearing stolen property right now. This is how Britain's biggest heist became Britain's deadliest curse, 1 bar of gold at a time. To understand how 6 men walked out of Heathrow with 3 tons of gold, we need to go back to the night before. November 25th, 1983. Brian Robinson was 40 years old, a career criminal from South London with a reputation for meticulous planning. His associates called him the Colonel because of how he organized operations. Every detail accounted for, every contingency planned, every man assigned a specific role. Robinson wasn't a street thug. He was a strategist, the kind of criminal who studied his targets for months before making a move. He'd spent 2 decades building a reputation in South London's underworld as someone who could plan a job down to the last second. Robinson had been watching the Brinks Mat warehouse for months. He knew security companies handled high-value cargo from Heathrow, cash transfers, foreign currency, diamonds, the kind of money that passed through airports every day without most people ever knowing. But Robinson had a problem. Brinks Mat was a fortress, armed guards, electronic alarms, steel doors. Breaking in from the outside was almost impossible. He needed someone inside, someone who could tell him exactly what was being stored, when guards changed shifts, and how to bypass the security systems. He found that person in his own family, and that made it personal. Anthony Black worked as a security guard at Brinks Mat. He was 31 years old, married to Robinson's sister, and he was drowning in debt. Black had borrowed money from Robinson to buy a flat. Now Robinson wanted something in return, not money, information. Black knew the warehouse layout. He knew the security codes. He knew which guards would be working the early shift on Saturday morning. Most importantly, he knew there was supposed to be £3 million in cash, waiting for distribution to banks across London. What Black didn't know was that 3 days earlier, an emergency shipment had arrived. 6,800 gold bars, owned by Johnson Matthey, a gold refining company. The bullion was sitting in the vault, waiting to be sorted. Total value with diamonds and cash included, £26 million. How do you turn a security guard into a criminal? You don't threaten him. You lend him money, and then you collect. Robinson assembled his crew, 6 men in total, all experienced armed robbers from South London. Mickey McAvoy, known as the Nutter, would lead the team inside. Robinson would coordinate from outside. Anthony White would drive. 3 others whose identities remain disputed to this day. They studied the warehouse for weeks. They knew the shift changes. They knew the patrol routes. They knew exactly when the outer door would be opened for the morning delivery. What they didn't know was that they were about to stumble into the biggest score of their lives. The Brinks Mat warehouse sat in Unit 7 of the Heathrow International Trading Estate. It was supposed to be one of the most secure facilities in Britain. Multiple layers of security protected whatever sat inside. Reinforced steel doors that could withstand explosives. Cameras covering every angle. Armed guards stationed around the clock. Alarm systems connected directly to the Metropolitan Police. Electronic sensors that would trigger if anyone breached the perimeter without authorization. On paper, it was impenetrable. In reality, every fortress has a weakness, and the weakness at Brinks Mat had a name. Anthony Black had provided impressions of the keys. He'd mapped out every camera blind spot. He'd memorized the codes that would bypass the electronic alarms. And on the morning of November 26, 1983, he was scheduled to work the early shift. How do you rob the most secure warehouse in Britain? You don't break in, you get invited. At 6:25 a.m., a security van pulled up to the warehouse. Standard procedure. The outer door opened to allow entry. At 6:40 a.m., 6 men in balaclavas made their move. They'd been waiting in the darkness, watching, counting the seconds between the outer door opening and closing. They knew there was a window of less than 30 seconds. 30 seconds to cross the loading bay and get through the door before it sealed shut. The moment the guards stepped away from the entrance, they rushed forward. 6 men sprinting across the concrete, moving with brutal efficiency, not a word spoken, just the sound of boots hitting tarmac. They were through the door before anyone could react. What if the guard had turned around? What if another vehicle had pulled into the loading bay? The entire plan hinged on those 30 seconds. Inside the warehouse, the morning shift was just starting. 6 staff members preparing paperwork, checking inventory, getting ready for the day's deliveries. None of them expected what came next. The robbers moved fast. They rounded up the staff within seconds, forcing them to the floor at gunpoint. 2 men covered the exits, 2 secured the guards, 2 headed straight for the vault. "We know where you live," one robber said. His voice was calm, almost conversational. "We know where your families live. Cooperate, and everyone goes home." One guard was so terrified, he forgot his half of the vault combination. His mind went blank. Total panic. The robbers weren't patient. They made him remember. Eventually, the guards gave up everything. Keys, codes, combinations. The plan was simple. Get in, get the cash, get out. 90 minutes maximum. But when the vault door swung open, the robbers froze. They'd expected stacks of foreign currency. What they found was something else entirely. Gray boxes stacked on pallets, 76 cardboard containers, and inside each one, gold bars. Row after row of solid gold bullion, each stamped with serial numbers and the Johnson Matthey logo. 6,800 bars, 3 tons of pure gold, worth 8 times what they'd come for. For a moment, nobody moved. The robbers stared at the gold. They looked at each other. They looked back at the gold. This wasn't part of the plan. They had come for cash. Cash is light. Cash fits in bags. Cash is easy to carry. Gold is heavy. Gold is traceable. Gold is a completely different problem. But 26 million pounds has a way of making problems seem solvable. The 3 million pounds in cash they'd expected, they barely looked at it. For the next hour and a half, they loaded gold into their vans. They used the warehouse's own forklift truck. They worked in a frenzy, carrying boxes until their arms burned. Each bar weighed approximately 12 kilograms. They loaded all 6,800 of them. By 8:15 a.m., they were gone. The entire operation had taken 81 minutes. What if one of the guards had managed to trigger the alarm? What if a police patrol had passed by during those 81 minutes? The guards waited in terror. They didn't dare move. They didn't dare call for help. They thought the robbers might come back. At 8:30 a.m., new staff arrived for the shift change. They found their colleagues bound and traumatized. One guard had managed to free himself and was shaking uncontrollably. By 9 a.m., every police unit in London was on alert. Commander Frank Cater of Scotland Yard's flying squad took charge of the investigation. He'd handled major robberies before, bank jobs, payroll heists, but nothing like this. He'd never seen anything like this. 3 tons of gold didn't just disappear. It had to go somewhere. It had to be moved. It had to be hidden. The question was, where? By 10 a.m., the robbery was on every news channel in Britain. The papers called it the crime of the century, the largest peacetime robbery in world history. Headlines screamed across every front page in the country. Politicians demanded answers. The public was fascinated and horrified in equal measure. A record reward of £2 million was offered for information leading to the gold's recovery. Police hoped money would loosen tongues in the underworld. It didn't. But here's the problem with stealing 3 tons of gold. You can't spend it. Every bar had a serial number. Every legitimate dealer in Britain knew those numbers within hours. Walk into any gold exchange with a Brinks Mat bar, and you'd be arrested before you could finish your sentence. The robbers had pulled off the perfect heist. Now they had the world's most recognizable gold sitting in their garages. Who would they turn to? Who in London's underworld could make £26 million in stolen bullion disappear? Where did they go? How did they find someone capable of handling that much gold? The answer would lead investigators down a path no one expected. They turned to Kenneth Noye. Noye was 36 years old. On paper, he was a legitimate gold dealer from Kent. In reality, he was one of London's most connected criminals. He had relationships with organized crime across Europe. He knew how to move illegal goods through legitimate channels, and he had access to something the robbers desperately needed: a smelter. Within days of the robbery, Noye had the gold. He transported it to a smelting operation in Bristol, run by a jeweler named John Palmer. The process was methodical. Each bar was placed in a crucible heated to over 1,000 degrees Celsius. The serial numbers melted away. The Johnson Matthey stamps dissolved into liquid gold. But pure gold from the Brinks Mat vault had a distinctive composition. Forensic analysis could still identify it, so Noye mixed the molten gold with copper coins, changing its chemical signature. He recast it into new forms: jewelry, coins, untraceable bullion that looked like it came from legitimate sources. The operation ran for months, crucibles burning day and night, gold flowing through the legitimate market. 2 days after the robbery, neighbors near a property in Bath, Somerset, saw something strange: a white-hot crucible operating in a garden hut. They suspected a connection to the heist and called police. Officers arrived, but claimed the property was just outside their jurisdiction. They said they'd pass the information along to the correct department. The neighbors were never asked to give statements. No one followed up on the tip. That smelting operation processed millions of pounds worth of Brinks Mat gold, while police looked the other way. How was that possible? Who was protecting the operation? Palmer's operation was enormous. He ran a company called Scadlin. He processed millions more in stolen gold, shipped it to Switzerland, sold it back into the legitimate market through European dealers. For his role, Palmer earned the nickname that would follow him to his grave: Goldfinger. But moving £26 million in gold through legitimate channels created another problem. The money had to go somewhere. Suddenly, £13 million was flowing through Bristol bank branches. The Bank of England noticed. They informed the police. Now here's a question worth thinking about. 6 robbers, 3 tons of gold, a smelting operation running day and night, and a corrupt network stretching across Europe. Did they really think they could keep this hidden forever? Drop your prediction in the comments, and subscribe, because what happens next will shock you. The investigators had one immediate advantage. A robbery this sophisticated required inside help. Someone had provided detailed information about the warehouse, security codes, shift schedules, the layout of the vault. Within days, they had their first lead. Anthony Black called in sick the day after the robbery. His colleagues noticed he was acting strangely, nervous, distracted. When detectives questioned him, his story didn't add up. They brought him in for formal questioning on December 4th, 1983, 8 days after the robbery. Black crumbled almost immediately. He confessed to providing the robbers with impressions of keys, details about security measures, and information about the vault. He identified his brother-in-law, Brian Robinson, as the ringleader. He named Mickey McAvoy as the man who led the team inside. He pointed to Anthony White as the driver. On December 7th, 10 days after the robbery, police arrested Robinson and McAvoy at their homes. But the gold was already gone. In January 1985, police placed Noye's property under surveillance. They knew gold was being processed somewhere. They suspected Noye's estate in West Kingsdown, Kent. Detective Constable John Fordham drew the assignment. He was an experienced undercover officer, part of an elite surveillance team known as C-11. Fordham had spent years on dangerous assignments. He was one of the best in the unit. On the night of January 26, 1985, he positioned himself in the woods near Noye's mansion. The grounds were dark. The property was surrounded by trees and hedgerows, perfect cover for surveillance. He was wearing camouflage, a balaclava, dark clothing that would help him blend into the shadows, standard equipment for a night operation. At 6:15 p.m., Noye came outside with his 3 Rottweiler dogs, large, aggressive animals trained to guard the property. The dogs detected Fordham hiding in the bushes. They began barking, loud, aggressive. Noye approached to investigate. He was carrying a torch. He swept the beam across the undergrowth. What happened next would become one of the most contested events in British criminal history. Noye claimed he thought Fordham was a burglar, a masked intruder on his property. He claimed he acted in self-defense. There was a confrontation in the garden. When it was over, Detective Constable John Fordham was dead. Fordham died on the property of the man he was sent to watch. A police officer killed while investigating Britain's biggest robbery. Noye was charged with murder. At trial, his defense team argued he had no way of knowing Fordham was a police officer. The man was masked. He was trespassing. The jury acquitted him. How could a man walk free after killing a police officer? It became one of Britain's most controversial verdicts in legal history. But police weren't finished. When they searched Noye's property after the incident, they found what they'd been looking for all along. 11 gold bars from the Brinks Mat robbery, buried in his garden, smelting equipment, financial documents showing he'd sold over £10 million worth of gold. In 1986, Kenneth Noye was convicted of conspiracy to handle stolen goods. He received 14 years. He served 7. But Noye had only handled a fraction of the gold, maybe a third. The rest had already spread to other criminals, other smelters, other dealers across 3 continents. And everyone who touched it seemed marked for death. They called it the curse of Brinks Mat. Between 1983 and 2015, at least 20 people connected to the robbery met violent ends. Some estimates put the number closer to 30. An extraordinary body count for a single robbery. More deaths than some gang wars produce over decades. Why did so many people die? Some theories point to greed. Partners betraying partners. Eliminate your associates. Keep their share. When millions of pounds are at stake, trust becomes a luxury no one can afford. Others say it was about silence. Too many people knew too much. The gold had passed through dozens of hands. Smelters, dealers, lawyers, accountants, bankers. Each one a potential witness. Each one a potential threat. The only way to guarantee no one talks is to make sure no one can talk. But the most disturbing theory connects Brinks Mat to international organized crime. The gold was sold to buyers across Europe, South America, and the Middle East. Criminal organizations that don't tolerate loose ends. Brian Perry helped launder McAvoy's share of the gold. In November 2001, months after his release from prison, he was killed outside his car in South London. The case remains unsolved. George Francis moved cash from the gold sales. In May 2003, he was killed outside his courier business in Bermondsey. Broad daylight. The case remains unsolved. Solly Nahom was a Hatton Garden jeweler who helped sell the smelted gold. In November 1998, he was killed outside his home in North London. The case remains unsolved. The pattern was unmistakable. Everyone who profited from Brinks Mat seemed to meet a similar fate. But the curse didn't just claim criminals. In May 1996, Kenneth Noye was released from prison. He'd served his time for handling stolen gold. He was a free man. On May 19, 1996, Noye was driving on the M25 motorway. Another driver, 21-year-old Stephen Cameron, cut him off at a slip road near Swanley, Kent. Road rage. Both drivers stopped their vehicles. Stephen Cameron got out of his car. His fiancée, 17-year-old Danielle Cable, watched from the passenger seat. There was an altercation. Noye had a knife. Stephen Cameron died on the side of the motorway. He was 21 years old. He had nothing to do with Brinks Mat. He was just a young man who cut off the wrong driver on a Sunday afternoon. The curse didn't care about innocence. Noye fled the country immediately. Within hours, he was on a private plane. Within days, he was in France, then Spain. For 2 years, he was one of Britain's most wanted fugitives. He escaped to the coast of southern Spain with help from John Palmer. Palmer knew the region well from his timeshare business in the Canary Islands. He arranged safe houses, new documents, a new identity. Noye settled near Cadiz. He lived openly under a false name, eating in restaurants, shopping in markets, living as if he hadn't just taken a young man's life on a British motorway. But British police never stopped looking. They tracked him across Europe, following leads from Interpol, monitoring known associates, waiting for Noye to make a mistake. In August 1998, Spanish authorities arrested him at a villa near Barbate. Danielle Cable flew to Spain with detectives. The 17-year-old girl, who had watched her fiancé die, was now a young woman of 19. She walked into a restaurant where Noye was eating. She looked him in the eye and confirmed his identity. The bravest thing anyone connected to this case ever did. In April 2000, a jury convicted Kenneth Noye of murder. He received a life sentence with a minimum of 16 years. Did justice finally catch up with the curse, or was there more blood to come? The original robbers didn't fare much better. Brian Robinson and Mickey McAvoy stood trial at the Old Bailey in December 1984, exactly 1 year after their arrests. The prosecution relied heavily on Anthony Black's confession and testimony. The jury convicted both men. Robinson and McAvoy each received 25 years, the harshest sentences for armed robbery in British history at that time. The judge called it the most audacious robbery in legal memory. Anthony Black, who had cooperated with authorities, received 6 years. He would later have to assume a new identity. His former associates wanted revenge. Anthony White was acquitted. The other 3 robbers were never identified. To this day, no one knows who they were. But here's what puzzled investigators for years. Robinson and McAvoy never talked. They never revealed where the gold went. They never cooperated beyond their initial arrests. Why would they stay silent for 16 years behind bars? Because they believed their shares were waiting for them. Hidden accounts, investments made by associates. They'd serve their time and collect their millions. Except, that's not what happened. While they sat in prison, their associates took their money. Brian Perry, the man McAvoy trusted to hold his share, kept it for himself. When McAvoy tried to negotiate with prosecutors, offering to return the gold in exchange for a reduced sentence, there was nothing left to return. The money had vanished, spent by the men they trusted most. In January 1995, the High Court ordered McAvoy to repay over £27 million, an order that could never be enforced. The gold was gone, melted, scattered across the world. Robinson and McAvoy were released in 2000 after serving 16 years. They'd missed births, funerals, their children growing up, their entire Middle Ages spent behind bars. Robinson died in a nursing home in South London in February 2021. He was 78 years old, reportedly penniless, estranged from the criminal world that had consumed his life. McAvoy moved to Spain after his release. He died on New Year's Eve 2022 at age 71 after a long battle with illness. The masterminds of Britain's biggest heist died with nothing. The gold had destroyed everyone who touched it. But what about Goldfinger? What about the man who turned 3 tons of stolen gold into a personal fortune? John Palmer made an estimated £300 million from Brinks Mat gold. He built a timeshare empire in Tenerife. He owned private jets, yachts, classic cars. His wealth put him on the Sunday Times rich list alongside the Queen. Could anyone escape the curse with that much money? On June 24, 2015, Palmer was in the garden of his heavily secured mansion in Essex. He was 65 years old, semi-retired, supposedly out of the criminal world. But a man who made £300 million from stolen gold is never truly out. Someone had been watching him. Police later found a hole cut in his garden fence, suggesting professional surveillance in the days before. Someone had been studying his routine, learning his habits, picking the right moment. At around 5:30 p.m., Palmer was burning rubbish in his garden, a normal evening activity, the kind of thing he did regularly. Someone entered the property through the hole in the fence. John Palmer was killed in his own garden, in broad daylight, at his heavily secured estate. No witnesses, no noise complaints from neighbors, a professional job from start to finish. Here's the disturbing part. Police initially thought Palmer died of natural causes. He'd recently had gallbladder surgery. When paramedics arrived, they saw wounds on his torso and assumed they were surgical complications. They didn't investigate further. It was only during the autopsy that the pathologist discovered the truth: 6 bullet wounds. Someone had shot John Palmer 6 times. Someone had executed Goldfinger and walked away without a trace. The police had a dead body and no suspects, no murder weapon, no CCTV footage, nothing. The case remains unsolved nearly 10 years later. and many investigators believe it will stay that way. Of the £26 million stolen in 1983, only about £2 million has ever been recovered. The rest was melted, sold, and scattered across the world. Some went to Europe, some to South America. Much of it stayed in Britain, mixed with legitimate gold and sold through normal channels. Some experts believe Brinks Mat money helped fuel the London property boom of the late 1980s. Millions of pounds in illegal cash pumped into real estate, driving up prices across the city. The robbery didn't just affect criminals, it shaped the British economy. Today, you can walk through London and pass buildings funded with Brinks Mat money. Legitimate on the surface, something darker underneath. The investigation technically remains open, one of Britain's longest-running criminal cases. But realistically, too much time has passed. Too many people are gone. The gold is long gone. In 2015, after Palmer's death, police issued a statement. They believe there are still people alive who know what happened to the gold. People who profited. People who stayed quiet. But those people have seen what happens to people who talk. November 26, 1983. 6 men walked into a warehouse expecting £3 million in cash. What they found was a curse. 6,800 gold bars, 3 tons of pure wealth, stolen in 81 minutes. 40 years later, the shadow of Brinks Mat still hangs over London's underworld. More than 20 people dead, hundreds of millions unaccounted for, and a trail of gold that stretches across 3 continents. Some crimes are too big, some treasures too valuable to steal. The moment those 6 men opened that vault, they set off a chain reaction that destroyed dozens of lives over 4 decades. There's a saying that captures everything you need to know. If you were lucky enough to miss out on Brinks Mat, you were lucky enough. And that brings us to the end of our story. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe and activate the bell button so you can receive new videos.